USS Washington, and USS South Dakota, quietly moved through the pitch-black waters of the Solomon Sea. The sky above was moonless, and the sea around them seemed endless and silent. Every man on board was alert, knowing the dangers that surrounded them near the coast of Guadalcanal. It was the night of November 14, 1942, and the tension was unbearable. The sailors were still shaken from the bloodshed of the earlier naval clash. There was no telling what could happen next. Everyone knew that this area was still full of danger, and another enemy attack could come at any moment. High above, on the bridge, Rear Admiral Willis Lee stood steady, watching the dark waves and scanning the horizon. He wasn't just waiting, he was actively hunting. He knew a much larger Japanese fleet was nearby, armed with more guns and ships. If they were spotted first, the enemy would have the upper hand. And in a night battle, that could mean total destruction. Lee understood the risk, but was prepared to gamble everything. The only thing working in his favor was the secret weapon they had aboard the advanced radar system on USS Washington. This radar was one of the most sophisticated of its time and unknown to most. It was Lee's greatest hope, and he believed it could be the deciding factor in the battle. Inside the ship's darkened control room, radar operators focused intensely on their glowing screens. The green light from the radar filled the space, giving the room an almost ghostly look. These men had to catch the enemy before the enemy saw them. Lee was one of the strongest supporters of radar. He had full confidence in it and believed it would transform naval warfare completely. For him, this wasn't just a tool, it was the future. The radar gave them a powerful advantage, letting them find enemy ships far beyond the reach of the human eye. It allowed them to prepare, aim, and strike before the Japanese even knew they were there. In Lee's mind, this was the one thing that could even the odds. Then, the quiet hum of the radar room was broken by a voice from one of the operators. Over the ship's speaker system came a calm but clear message. Target spotted to the north-northwest. 2 lines of ships moving at 21 knots. Range, 18,000 yards. Lee, unfazed, took a slow drag from his cigarette and looked over at Captain Glenn Davis. With quiet confidence, he said, "Well, get ready, Glenn. Here they come." The message raced through the ship, reaching the gun crews. Below the deck, sailors leaped to action. They began the slow and difficult job of preparing the ship's enormous 16-inch guns. These weapons were massive and required careful handling. The men knew they had little time, but they moved with purpose. The enemy was getting closer by the second. Japanese ships were sailing straight into what was about to be a deadly trap. But they had no idea. They couldn't see through the dark. They didn't know that 2 American battleships were waiting, armed and ready to strike with full force. Everything needed to go perfectly. If they failed, they wouldn't get another shot. It was now or never. The battle for Guadalcanal was one of the most important moments in the Pacific War. It was the first time the Allied forces went on the offensive against the Japanese Empire. The fighting was focused on Guadalcanal, one of the Solomon Islands. Both sides understood how important this island was. Whoever controlled Guadalcanal and its nearby waters would control the direction of the war in that region. For the United States, taking the island was critical. Guadalcanal had an airfield known as Henderson Field, which was key to protecting the supply routes between America and Australia. American planes could fly from this airfield to patrol the skies and defend shipping lanes. If the Japanese kept hold of the island, they could cut off these supplies and push deeper into the Pacific. They could use Guadalcanal as a base to attack other important locations. That made it absolutely necessary for the U.S. to win control and hold it. Only then could they plan future moves and stop Japanese expansion. On the other side, Japan saw Guadalcanal as a vital part of their defense system. It fit into their broader plan of building a protective wall around their captured territories. They wanted to prevent the Allies from coming too close to the Japanese homeland or reaching the rich lands of Southeast Asia. If they lost Guadalcanal, their whole southern line would be in danger. Their strategy would fall apart. So the Japanese were just as determined to fight for every inch of the island. The first major sea fight of the campaign happened between November 13th and 15th, 1942. It began when a Japanese group of warships, led by Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, moved in to bombard Henderson Field and bring more soldiers to the island. They didn't expect to be stopped, but a group of American ships, quickly pulled together and led by Rear Admiral Daniel J. Callahan, intercepted them. The two sides met in complete darkness. It was one of the most intense and confusing naval battles of the war. Ships fired at extremely close range. The fighting was fast, brutal, and chaotic. Visibility was near zero. Explosions lit the night, and ships were lost in minutes. Even though the American force was smaller and had fewer weapons, they fought with incredible bravery. They didn't back down. Their determination helped stop the Japanese from reaching the airfield, but the cost was high. Several American ships were sunk. USS Atlanta and USS Juneau were lost. Many sailors were killed, including both Admiral Callahan and Admiral Norman Scott. It was a tragic loss of leadership. Still, the Americans did serious damage to the enemy fleet. The Japanese had to pull back, giving the Americans a much-needed break. The next day, planes from Henderson Field chased the retreating Japanese ships. One of their targets was the damaged Japanese battleship Hiei. It was hit hard and eventually sank. That victory gave the United States a major boost. It showed that they could stand up to the powerful Japanese Navy and win. But the danger wasn't gone. Thanks to the work of American codebreakers who had managed to crack Japanese naval signals, Admiral William Halsey knew more trouble was coming. The Japanese weren't done. Another fleet was on its way, ready to strike again and finish what the first had started. But this time, Halsey and his forces were not going to be caught off guard. They were ready. As night fell on November 14th and stretched into the early hours of the 15th, the battle for Guadalcanal entered another fierce stage. A second wave of Japanese ships appeared, similar in strength to the earlier group. This force was led by the powerful battleship Kirishima, followed by 4 cruisers and 9 destroyers. Their goal was the same: destroy Henderson Field and allow more troops to land in the darkness without being attacked from the air. Admiral Halsey looked at his remaining ships and felt the pressure mounting. Most of his cruisers were either still locked in battle or so badly damaged they could not be used. Many of his destroyers had already been sunk. The situation was desperate. All he had left for surface combat were 2 battleships that had been guarding the damaged aircraft. Carrier Enterprise. These battleships, once symbols of strength and pride, had taken a back seat in recent times. Ever since the attack on Pearl Harbor, naval strategy had shifted toward aircraft carriers and submarines. Battleships were no longer the main focus. Instead, they were used to defend carriers from air attacks with their anti-aircraft guns. But now, in this moment of crisis, with almost no ships left and only 1 crippled carrier still afloat, Halsey had no other option. He had to send in his last battleships. They were the only line of defense left. Everything depended on them. If they failed, the Japanese would take Henderson Field, and the hard-fought progress of the past few days would be lost. Washington and South Dakota, both fairly new and packed with powerful weapons, got their next orders. They turned north, slicing through the waters near New Maya, heading straight toward the dangerous stretch of sea known as Iron Bigham Sound. They were not turning back. They were going in ready for a serious fight. Rear Admiral Willis Lee was about to take the lead in this crucial moment. Lee, a seasoned Navy officer and a veteran from the First World War, had long supported using radar in the Navy. By the early 1940s, he had become one of the most knowledgeable people on the subject, sometimes even knowing more than the men who actually operated the equipment. His deep understanding of radar played a big role in helping the Navy adjust to the new challenges of modern sea battles, especially when visibility was low. Lee had years of experience commanding both destroyers and cruisers, and he was known for being sharp and forward-thinking when it came to strategy. His talents were recognized when he was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1942, as he sailed to confront a Japanese force that was larger and better armed. He put his full trust in radar. He believed it would be the key to winning against the odds. By the time of the second naval clash near Guadalcanal, both American ships were fitted with SG radar, a top-level system that gave them a huge edge. This type of radar could spot ships and even planes far off in the distance even at night or in bad weather. Thanks to this technology, Washington and South Dakota could track enemy ships long before anyone could see them with the naked eye. The Japanese Navy, on the other hand, didn't have anything nearly as advanced. They had built a few radar systems, but they weren't widely used and weren't nearly as effective as the American ones. Most Japanese ships still depended on eyesight and basic range tools to detect enemies. The U.S. had been working on radar since the late 1930s, and during the early years of the war, they made big steps forward. Getting this equipment onto ships, like Washington and South Dakota, had been done quietly, kept hidden from the enemy, to avoid giving away the advantage. Now, Admiral Lee was ready to use radar as his secret weapon, but he had to do it smartly. If he revealed too much, the Japanese might catch on and adapt, as both fleets moved through the blackness of night toward each other. The outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign was hanging by a thread. At exactly 10:30 p.m., the SG radar on Washington picked up signs of something big. It came to life with a burst of static, showing 2 lines of enemy ships closing in fast at 21 knots. The distance was only 18,000 yards, now and shrinking quickly. Up on the bridge, Admiral Lee stood with his cigarette glowing in the dark, lighting up his tired face. He looked at Captain Glenn Davis and said in a calm but serious tone, "Well, get ready, Glenn, here they come." The words hit hard, a quiet warning that the real battle was about to begin. Down in the narrow hallways of the ship, the call to load the main guns sent the crew into action. The ship echoed with noise as the sailors jumped into their practiced routine. With speed and discipline, they worked around the enormous 16-inch guns. Heavy shells, each weighing 2,700 pounds, were slammed into place. At the same time, 100-pound powder bags were tossed into position with practiced hands. A job that usually took half a minute was done in just 15 seconds, proof of how sharp and focused the crew was. Time dragged on slowly, every second feeling like an hour as they waited for the right moment. Finally, at 11:13 p.m., the order came. Lee gave the command, "Open fire when ready." In a heartbeat, the night exploded. 9 massive shells, each a deadly force on its own, roared out of Washington's guns. The sound was deafening, shaking the sky and sea. The Japanese cruiser Sendai was caught completely off guard, sitting in the middle of a storm of steel. Giant pillars of water shot into the air as the shells crashed into the sea around the enemy ships. The water rose like buildings, and everything turned into chaos. The Japanese had no idea that American battleships were even there. They were completely shocked as massive bursts of water exploded around them. The powerful guns of South Dakota had opened fire too, and the Japanese panicked. Their radio chatter, which was picked up by American listeners, was filled with fear. The cruiser Sendai and the ships guarding it turned and fled, trying to get away from the American firepower as fast as possible. This part of the battle had gone perfectly. The Japanese had walked into it blindly and were now running away in disorder. But things didn't all go in favor of the Americans. The Japanese still had more ships, especially destroyers, and they were moving in for a fight. On board Washington, Admiral Lee watched nervously as his own destroyers rushed forward to take on the Japanese destroyers. But it didn't go well. One after another, his destroyers were hit and taken out of action in just minutes. All 4 of them were gone, leaving Washington and South Dakota to stand alone against the rest of the Japanese fleet. Lee felt a wave of sorrow as his battleship pushed through the wreckage left behind by the lost destroyers. Among the floating debris and smoke, a single voice was heard from the water. A sailor, barely staying afloat, shouted toward the towering ship, "Get after M. Washington." The battleship continued ahead at 26 knots, guns still blazing into the night. Lee tried to make contact with Captain Gatch on South Dakota, but there was no response. The ship had suffered a major electrical failure, leaving it in complete darkness. It was moving forward blindly, unable to communicate or use its weapons properly. Just as the power was restored, it failed again, leaving the ship vulnerable. In a critical moment, even with all its electrical troubles, South Dakota kept fighting. The crew managed to fire the main guns and landed hits on 2 Japanese cruisers that were targeting the ship with flames and shells. But South Dakota was badly damaged. It had been hit more than 26 times, including a heavy 14-inch shell that caused major destruction. Fires raged across the upper parts of the ship. It could no longer stay in the battle and had to fall back. That left Washington alone. Admiral Lee and his ship now faced the full force of the Japanese fleet without backup. His eyes locked onto the radar screen, which showed a massive shape moving on their right side. The tension was so strong, it felt like electricity in the air. They weren't sure if what they were seeing was the enemy or their own sister ship, South Dakota, still drifting without lights or power. No one could say for sure, and that uncertainty added to the growing sense of danger. Lee's voice broke the stillness and gave a clear command to hold fire. He didn't want to take any risks by accidentally firing on their own ships. His order moved quickly through the crew, forcing everyone to hold back, even though they were ready and eager to open fire. Moments later, a beam of light cut through the darkness. Kirishima's searchlight had locked onto South Dakota, revealing her shape in the black night. There was no more doubt. The enemy had made the first move, and now it was time to respond. Washington was only about 8,400 yards away from the target, well within range of her massive main guns. Without hesitation, Lee gave the order to begin firing. The battleship shook as its large guns thundered into action, launching a series of shells at the Japanese ship. The first round didn't hit directly, but it landed close enough to let the enemy know what was coming. Kirishima was suddenly surrounded by explosions, and the warning had been delivered. Seconds later, Washington fired again. This time, one of the powerful shells struck the Japanese ship hard, destroying the third-level bridge and instantly killing everyone in that section. Then came another devastating round. 5 more shells slammed into the center of Kirishima, ripping into her structure and causing massive destruction. The force of the hits tore open large holes, crushed metal walls, and shredded her decks. One shell hit below the waterline, cutting into the hull and causing water to rush in uncontrollably from one side of the ship to the other. Though badly damaged, Kirishima tried to fight back. She fired her own huge shells toward Washington, and some passed so close to the American ship that Lee could feel the wind they created rushing past him. The 2 ships were now so close that it felt like they were fighting with knives. Washington's smaller guns joined the fight, blasting away at Kirishima's upper areas and tearing them apart with every hit. Lee gave the crew permission to shoot at anything they could see. It was a green light to go all in. At just under 8,000 yards away, Washington fired again. This time, 2 shells smashed into the front of Kirishima, destroying one of her big forward gun turrets in seconds. The final blow came quickly. A shell from Washington hit Kirishima's steering system, jamming her rudder hard to one side. The damage was so severe that the ship began to spin in circles, unable to steer or escape. After being struck more than 20 times by Washington's main guns, and taking countless hits from her smaller weapons, Kirishima couldn't take any more. Fires burned across her deck, and she leaned to one side as water poured in. Eventually, she rolled over completely. Her rear section lifted out of the water before the entire wreck disappeared beneath the waves. The rest of the Japanese fleet, now without their main battleship, made one last attempt to strike back. They fired torpedoes wildly into the darkness, more out of frustration than with any hope of hitting a target. Then they turned and escaped into the night. Badly beaten, Lee knew there was no need to chase them. Washington had done her job. The enemy had been stopped, and their morale crushed, along with their ships. He ordered the ship to move away in a zigzag path, leaving behind a sea filled with smoke, floating wreckage, and a heavy blow to the pride of the Japanese Navy. The fierce fight between Washington and South Dakota against a larger enemy force became a turning point. The Americans had won a major victory, though it came at a cost. 4 American destroyers had been lost, and South Dakota had taken serious damage, struck over 24 times, including a hit from a huge shell that nearly disabled her. Even so, Admiral Lee's use of radar and his smart battle decisions helped secure the win. Kirishima, the powerful Japanese battleship, was gone after taking repeated hits from Washington's heavy guns. The Japanese also lost the cruiser Sendai and several destroyers as they tried to retreat. The number of dead was high on both sides. Around 242 American sailors were killed, including Admirals Daniel J. Callahan and Norman Scott, who had died earlier in the campaign. The Japanese losses were far worse, with over 1,500 sailors killed, many of them aboard the ships that were destroyed. The loss of so many important Japanese warships weakened their navy's ability to continue fighting in the Pacific. Strategically, the outcome had a big impact. The Americans were able to keep control of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, which meant they could protect their supply lines to Australia and continue launching attacks in the region. After this defeat, the Japanese had to start rethinking their plans to expand further. This battle marked the beginning of a long series of setbacks for Japan. Admiral Lee's name became linked with this major victory and with the smart use of radar. His belief in the power of new technology and his ability to change tactics during the fight showed just how forward-thinking he was. He helped prove that radar could completely change the way battles were fought at sea. His leadership played a key role in winning the fight and showed just how important technology had become in modern war. His actions during the Second Naval Battle near Guadalcanal left a lasting mark, showing the true potential of radar in changing the outcome of war. As the smoke cleared and the waves calmed over Iron Bottom Sound, one thing became certain: this battle was more than just a clash of ships. It was a turning point, not only in the struggle for Guadalcanal, but in the evolution of naval warfare itself. Admiral Lee's calm leadership, paired with cutting-edge radar technology, proved that strategy and innovation could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The sinking of Kirishima marked the beginning of a shift in momentum where the Japanese Navy, once feared and dominant, began its long retreat in the Pacific. This wasn't just a victory won by firepower, it was won by bravery, by foresight, and by those who fought in the shadows of giants. The legacy of that night lives on in the quiet courage of those sailors, and in the belief that even in the darkest hours, the tide of war can be turned by those bold enough to rise and meet it.